What if I told you that every nation, every kingdom, every civilization, and every empire can trace its origins back to a single family, a family that stepped out of an ark onto a cleansed world? Most people read Genesis chapter 10 and see only names that seem difficult to pronounce, names that appear disconnected from modern life. But hidden inside this chapter is the beginning of human civilization itself, the birth of nations, the rise of kings, the foundation of empires, and the first signs of a rebellion that would soon challenge heaven itself. By the end of this story, you will understand why this chapter is far more important than it first appears. The flood had ended, the earth was renewed, humanity had been given another opportunity. Noah and his family stood as the ancestors of every future generation. From 3 sons, an entire world would emerge: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. 3 names, 3 family lines, 3 branches from which countless nations would eventually grow. Imagine the world at this moment. No vast empires, no great cities, no kingdoms, only the descendants of a single family beginning to spread across the earth. Yet within those descendants lay the future of humanity. From Japheth came many peoples who would spread across distant lands. Families multiplied, generations expanded, communities formed, languages developed. The foundations of future nations began to take shape. The earth was slowly being populated once again. But then Genesis introduces a figure who stands apart from the others, a man whose name would echo throughout history: Nimrod. Pause for a moment. Among dozens of names listed in this chapter, only one receives special attention. Why? Because Nimrod represented something new, something powerful, something dangerous. Scripture describes him as a mighty man upon the earth, a mighty hunter before me. His influence grew rapidly. His power expanded. His reputation spread. But this was about more than hunting. This was about leadership, authority, ambition, the rise of organized human power. For the first time since the flood, large kingdoms began to emerge, and Nimrod stood at the center of them. His kingdom began in Babel. Remember that name, Babel, because what begins here will soon become one of the most famous events in all of Scripture. A story of pride, a story of ambition, a story of humanity attempting to reach heaven on its own terms. But that story is still ahead. For now, Genesis simply introduces the man whose influence helped shape that future rebellion. From Nimrod's kingdom came cities, from cities came nations, from nations came civilizations. Humanity was multiplying exactly as I had commanded. Yet beneath the surface, the seeds of pride were already beginning to grow. The descendants of Ham continued spreading across the earth. Entire people groups emerged. Regions expanded. Borders formed. Families became tribes. Tribes became nations. Among these descendants were names that would later become familiar throughout Scripture: the Canaanites, the people who would eventually inhabit lands that played major roles in biblical history. Even here, generations before many future events unfolded, the foundations were already being laid. Nothing in history happens by accident. Long before great battles occur, long before kings rise and fall, long before prophecies are fulfilled, the groundwork is already being prepared. Then the chapter turns toward Shem, and this is where something remarkable begins to happen, because while many nations emerge from Noah's descendants, one particular family line receives special attention: the line of Shem, Why? Because through this line, my redemptive plan would continue. Through this lineage would come Abraham. Through Abraham would come Israel. Through Israel would come prophets, kings, promises, and eventually me. At this point, the people in the story could not possibly understand what lay ahead. They simply lived their lives, raised families, built communities, expanded into new territories. Yet generation after generation was moving history toward a greater purpose. This is an important reminder. People often want to see the entire plan. They want immediate answers, immediate understanding. Yet many times my purposes unfold across generations. What seems ordinary today may become part of something extraordinary tomorrow. Among Shem's descendants appears another intriguing detail, a man named Peleg. Scripture says that during his days the earth was divided, a brief statement, yet one filled with mystery. Many have wondered exactly what this division refers to. Was it geographical? Was it cultural? Was it connected to events soon to unfold? Whatever the case, the world was changing. Humanity was spreading. The nations were forming. The stage was being set for the next great chapter in human history. As Genesis chapter 10 comes to a close, we see the descendants of Noah filling the earth, different families, different lands, different languages beginning to emerge, different nations taking shape. What began with 8 survivors leaving an ark had now become the foundation of the human race. But something else was happening beneath the surface. As humanity multiplied, so did pride. As cities grew, so did ambition. As nations expanded, so did the desire for independence from me. And soon, that desire would lead to one of the greatest acts of collective rebellion ever recorded. A city, a tower, a people determined to make a name for themselves, a people convinced they no longer needed me. The story of Genesis chapter 10 may seem like a list of names, but it is actually the bridge between the flood and the next great turning point in human history. It shows how the world was repopulated, how nations were born, how kingdoms emerged, and how humanity slowly began drifting toward another confrontation with heaven. Perhaps the greatest lesson of this chapter is that every nation has a common origin, every people group, every language, every culture, every civilization. All trace their beginnings back to the same family, and that truth reminds us of something important. Humanity may be divided by borders, languages, traditions, and histories, but at its core, humanity remains one family. A family created in my image, a family still in need of redemption, and a family whose story is far from over. If this story has deepened your understanding of Scripture, subscribe to Primordial Lore and continue exploring the greatest stories ever told. And now, continue to the next chapter, where humanity unites under one language, builds a tower reaching toward heaven, and attempts to create a legacy without me.